3, 2, 1. Good luck.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Agnieszka Otwinowska-Kasztelanic, and on behalf of the University of Warsaw Excellence Initiative, I have the pleasure to chair the series of 6 lectures entitled Current Trends in Multilingualism Research. I would like to thank all the speakers who have agreed to take part, most of whom are members of the International Association of Multilingualism. I also want to extend my thanks to all the people from the University of Warsaw who are kind of behind the scenes, but who made my initiative come true. Today, for the opening lecture, we're welcoming Professor Raphael Berthele from the University of Fribourg. He studied and worked at the Universities of Fribourg, Tübingen, Berkeley, and Berne. In 2008, he co-founded the Fribourg Institute of Multilingualism, and he is a member of the board of directors of the institute. Currently, Professor Berthele directs the MA programs in multilingualism studies and in foreign language pedagogy. His research interests cover different areas, from cognitive to social aspects of multilingualism, such as intercomprehension, receptive competencies, and cross-linguistic interaction. Professor Berthele has published widely in the areas of linguistics, cognitive linguistics, comparative linguistics, and research into language acquisition and language education. He's the author and co-author of 7 books and over 100 book chapters and journal articles published in English, German, and French. During the last years, he has focused on the empirical investigation of receptive multilingualism, on the acquisition of literacy skills in multilinguals, on spatial reference in bilinguals and multilinguals, and on individual differences in language learning. He has co-edited a special issue of the prestigious Language Learning, a top journal in the field of applied linguistics. The issue devoted to multilingualism research is just out in February 2021. Since 2020, Professor Berthele has been the president of the International Association of Multilingualism, which gathers European researchers interested in multilingualism studies and the acquisition of multiple languages. Raphael, Professor Berthele, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Agnieszka, and the organizers for giving me the opportunity to give this online talk, online lecture. It is obviously a great honor to be the one who starts this series of lectures with fabulous colleagues who will follow. The talk I'm going to give is a relatively general, but also relatively personal talk. It is obviously, I don't pretend to represent the whole field of multilingualism research. I will give you my view of the field, a little bit of the history of engagement of scholars with multilingualism, and then some examples from our research. It's not just my research, the research of our group here in Fribourg in Switzerland. I will try to be non-technical in this talk. You will see that I quite like quantitative approaches, hypothesis testing. And if you're interested in the details, you can download a lengthy handout with all the references and figures. So if my slides are overpopulated, just relax, listen, and download the handout if you're really interested in. So we'll share my screen now with you. All right. So as linguists, we would like to become famous for terms or theories, or at least found a school. So far, unfortunately, I haven't been very successful. And my worry is that my attempt to define multilingualism here will also be a rather unsuccessful attempt. So my definition, which I think is a really lousy definition of multilingualism, is as follows. A multilingual is a speaker here who actually masters N Ys. So the goal of this is not to become famous with this definition, but I would like to show you and explain why I think that the field will never completely agree on a Aristotelian or watertight definition of what multilingualism is, a definition, involving necessary and sufficient criteria, because the field, the nature of the subject of our study is extremely variable on several dimensions. So a multilingual is a speaker who exly masters N-wise. Exly refers to the x-axis here, which basically means that the mastery of languages, and I'm sorry, this is very trivial, I know, but it's important to point it out. The mastery of languages in the repertoire can be extremely skewed or unbalanced, or it can be perfectly balanced, although I think this is a rather exceptional case. So different degrees of proficiency, competence, mastery, whatever you want to call it. Whys, what are we talking about? On the y-axis, I map the question of what is the actual thing that we count in the multilingual repertoire. Are we talking about proper languages? And please note that I'm not saying that there are good languages and bad languages, but there are good examples of the category of language, at least in our culture. So my native dialect, a Swiss German dialect, is not a good example of a language, but probably Standard French is a good example of a language. That's what I mean here. But of course, we all know linguists cannot even define only on linguistic grounds what a language is. So obviously, dialects somehow need to appear in the definition of multilingualism. So maybe a multilingual with several dialects, or at least one dialect, is also multilingual. Or maybe we can go even further and say it's not just language as dialects, it could also be within language variability, as in styles, registers, ways of speaking. So what I'm trying to say here is that multilingualism as a category, I believe, will never be entirely defined in scientific terms. And scientific, I mean, Aristotelian categories, as I said, with necessary and sufficient features. It is, however, a natural category. That would be my point here. With prototypical cases of multilinguals, think of the super polyglots. Those are probably prototypical multilinguals. They might not be demographically the most frequent monolinguals out there. Maybe we could also just stipulate that a person who speaks 3 or more languages, standard languages, codified languages, might be a good example for a multilingual, a prototypical multilingual. But then we have other multilinguals, which we could call regular multilinguals, with 1 dominant language and 2 non-dominant languages. So the difference here would be this one is really completely balanced, perfect in 3 languages. It exists, I guess, but it's very rare. And then there's limiting cases where, for instance, somebody has absolutely stunning command of 1 language with several registers within the language. So maybe there's such a thing as within language multilingualism. It's probably not prototypical multilingualism, but it exists. And maybe for some research questions, it is useful to count them in the category of multilinguals. So I hope you understand what I'm trying to say is that if we construe of multilingualism and bilingualism, and actually also something like a language, in terms of natural categories, like trees, like people's ideas about trees or birds, then we understand that, okay, so there's good examples for birds and there's bad examples for birds. And probably the same is the case for multilingualism. So we have at least 3 dimensions of variability. There must be more. The proficiency dimension, the what is it actually that we count? Should we count at all? And how many of them need to be there? That would be the end. Okay, so if we now look at how scholars and how societies or discourse in society engages with multilingualism, it is also useful to look back a little bit in time. Currently, of course, multilingualism is quite a hot topic in many places, in many countries, on many continents, in terms of policy. What should countries, schools, families implement in terms of multilingual or monolingual policies? There's a lot of activism. Think of the minority language activism, But there's also other things related to language, for instance, gender, race activism that also involves language policy. And of course, there's the whole question of schools. What are the best school curricula? Should they be multilingual, bilingual, monolingual? So those are all social topics or issues. The scholarly fields, I'm a linguist, of course, I put linguistics first, but there's a lot of other fields, of course, that engage with questions of multilingualism, from pedagogy to sociology and history. So there's the scholarly engagement with multilingualism is not just scholarship, and it's not just social policy, but of course it's scholarship that is somehow also influenced by social policy. Historically, I think linguistics and thinking about language was to some extent monolingual for quite a long time. So think of Wilhelm Humboldt, who is actually still an important figure in cognitive linguistics because he had some really interesting thoughts on language and thought and the relationship between the two. But on the other hand, he had a very, I think many of us perceive his views on the relationship of nations, ethnically defined, and languages as rather problematic. So here, I'm sorry, this is in German. So the Seele der Nation, the soul of a nation, is expressed in the language. So as I said, Humboldt is still quite influential in cognitive linguistics, but I think cognitive linguists today wouldn't frame it that way anymore. So, but you can see the importance here of nation, of the soul of a nation expressing itself via language. There's the idea in early linguistics that languages are systems in a very strict sense of the term. So perfectly designed systems, if you change one bit in the system, the whole system will adapt and will change. I'm not saying here that this was a monolingual ideology about language, because even the earliest linguists were very much interested, for instance, in variability and dialects and also contact. But there was this notion of the perfectly constructed system that paved the way, I guess, for other quite extreme idealizations of what language is, perfect mastery, not performance, but real competence, idealized, monolingual. The idea of the native speaker that is still very, very dear to many in the field is also rooted, I think, in this thinking. And so as a consequence, many people in the early 20th century and also even earlier in the 19th century thought that bilingualism was detrimental to cognition. There are some often cited studies like from Wales, that one from Wales here, and another one from a Scottish scholar, Laurie, who says, if it were possible for a child or boy to live in two languages at once, equally well, so much the worse. His intellectual and spiritual growth would not thereby be doubled but halved. So as you can see, this is a rather negative view of bilingualism, and it is a very, very strict view of what a language is, what a system is, and therefore also what native speaker proficiency should be. I am not saying that in the past nobody was interested in bilingualism or multilingualism, but these are thoughts that shaped modern linguistics for quite a long time. So I think they are important to keep in mind. On the other hand, and I count myself in there, many people today are interested in social dynamics, yielding linguistic patterns. Of course, Labov, sociolinguistics is important to mention here. So we're not talking about the nation, we're talking about social dynamics giving rise to linguistic patterns. And here, and this is important, so this is 19th century, very early on, some linguists, they were a minority, but some linguists were actually convinced that there's no such thing as an unmixed, pure system. All languages are mixed. This is Schuchart, who was the founder of modern Creole studies. Today, I'm quite sure that most of us are familiar with this idea that bilingualism is good for the brain, is good for cognition, and is good for additional language learning. This basically, the impetus for this idea, I think, came mainly from Canada in the 1960s. And if you look at, for instance, European policy documents, you will see that there's actually quite a lot of expectations regarding multilingualism, what multilingualism and multilingual education should do and will do for individuals and societies. A plurilingual perspective, we firmly believe, would help reinforce societies democratically, socially, and in terms of citizenship. So not only is there beneficial effects on cognition, on aging, but also on societies. So I hope you can see that we're dealing with two completely different views of language, and we can say two different ideologies. And if you just look at the last point, so you can see completely opposing views on what bi or multilingual education does or doesn't do. Okay, so I think in the past this one was more important, and this one became more important more recently. But I am actually not saying that there's a clear the past was this and the present is something new. I think this tension between those two ideologies still exists and will still be activated, for instance, in language policy discourses, or also in scholars' practices. If you look at what scholars claim is the case and what they then actually do. So I think this is an interesting tension, but there is a tension there. All right, so we have what I propose to call essentialization of linguistic competence of the language and the monolingual bias in the past, and maybe today what we could call a celebrationist bias, a celebrationist view of bilingualism and multilingualism, where actually monolingualism all of a sudden becomes a disease that needs curing. Okay, so if we look at this figure here with the social discourse on the one hand and the scholarly fields, what we see is that we have on the one hand this monolingual bias that pulls towards standardization, monolingual language, high proficiency in one language, and we have this as a reaction to this bias, what I call the celebrationism. Celebration of bilingualism and linguistic diversity and multilingualism and all these things. So in my talk, I will not focus that much on social questions of multilingualism. I will mainly focus on individual differences. They only gave me 45 minutes, so I can only talk about one thing, but I think it is also very interesting to look at social language policy discourse and all these things, but I won't have the time to do it here. So in terms of individual multilingualism, I think the field, there are a certain number of points on which I think we in the field agree. I think nobody would disagree with the claim that the locus of contact is the bi-multilingual individual. That's where the languages are actually in contact. But that there are also social constraints that are very important in the way bilingualism, multilingualism is shaped and lived and expresses itself. I also think that it is pretty uncontroversial that one of the central things that we do in our field is systematically investigate how the languages in the repertoires interact. The term that most of us use is cross-linguistic influence, sometimes called transfer also, or interference, a more negative term. I think pretty much everybody agrees that this is a central field of investigation. And related to this also, I think we all agree that multilinguals are not simply multiple monolinguals. So that we can't just multiply monolingual proficiency and then we understand what the multilinguals are. I think this is all pretty uncontroversial. There's a lot of disagreement in our field. And I will talk about the disagreement mainly in focus on this, because it's more interesting to disagree. It's not interesting if everybody just agrees. So for instance, there's a lot of disagreement and there's an increasing movement in the field that actually, because of the problems that I pointed out when I showed you my graph with the impossible definition of multilingualism, because linguists can't define and draw boundaries between the languages, can't count them, so let's get rid of them. Let's not use those named languages anymore to refer to the multilinguals repertoire. Let's just talk about the fluid continuum of language. Let's not talk about language as a thing, as an essentialized thing, but just about translanguaging, doing stuff with words and language in general, without drawing boundaries. And other people are more conservative and think, well, languages still may be a useful reference point, even if we acknowledge that it is difficult to define them and to separate them. And as you might have figured out, I am among those more conservative people. In pedagogy, there is a big debate whether the multilingual shift, this new way of teaching languages that is being implemented in many, certainly European countries, leads to better proficiency, whether all these beneficial effects will actually can be observed or not, whether this pedagogy should be implemented. This is, I would say, still highly controversial. There is also an important debate whether our research should still try to be falsifiable in the Popperian sense, that formulate theories that then can be empirically put to the test, not the theories or hypotheses based on those theories. Those would be people, for instance, from the complex dynamic systems approach, who would say generalizability is very difficult. Individuals are so different. Everything is nonlinear, complex, and very dynamic in time. So these people would actually, have a harder time generalizing. Sometimes don't want to generalize at all. So if you're interested in this debate, there's a recent paper out by Gabriele Palotti that is very interesting that taps into this question. The question of cognitive advantages is highly controversial, whether they actually exist, what they are exactly. If you're interested in that, there's a very nice stimulating talk by Thomas Bach, recent talk on Abralin. You'll find it in the internet with a very nuanced, I think, approach to the question. I'm not going to talk about this. My topic for today's talk is, I'm a linguist, as I said, I'm not a cognitive scientist. So I am interested in the much maybe simpler question in a way, whether multilinguals are better language learners and whether knowing several languages or dialects leads to better language learning and using. Better, faster learning, different learning, that kind of question. So that's what my talk is going to be focusing on. So one way of going about that we explored for quite some time in the past was we gave multilinguals language stimuli, texts or words in languages that they don't know, but languages that are genealogically related to languages they master. So here you have an example from one of those studies. We presented, this is Romanche-sur-Silvan, which is a minority language spoken in eastern Switzerland. It's a Romance language. And we presented our Italian and French speakers, multilinguals, with a text or words in this language. And we asked them different questions. But for instance, one question would be, so what does the word liu means? Which is a word. So referring to the text. And then people would have to figure out what that word might mean. So somebody answered, it means lieu, French, place. And the inferencing, so the person drew an inference based on knowledge of Italian, which is similar to Romanche. And yes, that's a correct inference. It's not just about being right or wrong. Sometimes being wrong is actually quite interesting. So here, for instance, this person says, oh, this is regarder, to watch. Because there's a Swiss-German verb, schauen, which looks very similar. It's not correct, but it's an interesting inference. So that's the kind of things we were looking at. Why is this relevant? Well, from a policy point of view, you could argue that if everybody understands, for instance, in a quadrilingual country, in a multilingual country like Switzerland, where Italian is an official language, you could argue people don't need to speak Italian, but if they speak French and German, but understand Italian, that would give a boost to the usage context in which Italian can be used. So there's a policy relevance there as well. And there's also, of course, a pedagogical relevance and a psycholinguistic relevance. Understanding these inferencing processes, as many of us would argue, including Agnieszka, tells us something about learning additional languages. And so, yeah, Agnieszka's work is very important because it is experimental work that tries to test the impact of awareness-raising activities in language teaching that actually focus on this kind of phenomenon, on cognate languages and words. So there's quite a lot of research on this kind of inferencing task in Germanic, in Romance, in Finno-Ugric, in Slavic, and probably also in other languages. You can actually, there's two main perspectives on this. You can look at the linguistic distance. You can basically try to figure out how different the languages or the words can be, and people can still figure out their meaning. We did that, but I'm not going to talk about it. You find references on the handout. And the other question is, who are the people who are actually good at doing this, at drawing this kind of inference? So what are the individual determinants? What is their linguistic repertoire? What are other cognitive measures that may play a role in doing this kind of task? And that's the point that I will be talking about in the remainder of this talk. All right, so we have two main candidates for the explanation of variability in doing that kind of task, which in a way could be seen as representing very, very embryonic learning of a target language, okay? So we can, on the one hand, say it's the multilingual repertoire that will lead to good skills in this kind of inferencing task. Or you could say it's cognition. It's if somebody is just smarter, has a better memory, or maybe other cognitive aspects. And of course, you have to ask also, so to what extent are these two things actually related? What are the causal relationships? Is the repertoire good for cognition? Yeah. That's something many people would claim, or is it actually the other way around? Or is it just a correlation and we actually can't figure out the causality? So those are questions I'm interested in. Okay, so to answer these questions, we did many different series of different studies, and I'm going to talk about cognate words now. So that's the third task that you see here. We presented speakers of German, some of them dialect speakers, some of them first language speakers of standard German, with isolated words in Danish and Swedish, and we told them these are Scandinavian verbs. We told them it's verbs. They were all high frequency and all cognate. And so they had to translate them, and we just scored them correct or not correct. And then we looked at their profiles. In this first study, we basically asked them, what are the languages that you speak and on what level do you speak them? My expectation was, as a multilingualism scholar, I expected multilinguals to outperform. So the more multilingual you are, the better you should be. That's the middle graph here. Yes, there is a positive slope, so there is an association. But if you actually look a little bit more closely at what kind of multilingualism, you discover surprising things. Fortunately, that was not the initial plan of the study. Fortunately, I included 2 items on dialect skills. I just thought, okay, so it might be interesting to ask them whether they are dialect speakers or whether they at least understand dialects. And if you put this score, like an aggregate score of dialect proficiency in the model, that's actually the best predictor for this task. So it is basically how good you master the dialect. Of course, you master the German dialect, you also master the standard language, especially if you are a university student, which all these people were in Switzerland and in Germany. All right, and then also English, self-assessed English proficiency was also a significant predictor. So if you add these 3 predictors into the model, it's actually the dialect that is the most important one. And the number of languages is not even significant anymore, although I don't think that's really crucial whether something is significant here or not. What is important is that dialect seems to be something that, fortunately, I included, but many people tend to forget. So in a way, that shows the problem with the monolingual bias. What does it mean to be a speaker of German? That's, with respect to this task, apparently pretty meaningless. What is interesting is whether you have some other form of German as well in your repertoire. So there's a language zero, as I call it here. German is not sufficient to categorize, so you have to include varieties. What I did not do in this study was I didn't measure anything cognitive. I mean, I didn't, these are just students, so you can assume that they are maybe in a certain range when it comes to cognitive abilities, but I didn't control for it, I didn't test for it. So to what extent is cognition relevant to do the task? That's a question that we addressed in another project, in a larger project, together with colleagues from different universities. And what I'm going to show you here is basically Jan van Hove's thesis, which was one sub-component of this joint project. We did, again, a study on cognate guessing. So it's a similar task with only Swedish words. 45 words presented visually and 45 words presented orally in headphones. All of them had cognates in either German or English or French or a combination thereof. So they were all potentially recognizable for our participants. But this time we didn't only ask them about their repertoire, we also tested their English skills, and we did a lot of cognitive tests. These are just 3 of them, but we even did more. But these 3 turned out to be interesting. All right, so now we can actually answer this question, to what extent cognition also predicts the ability to infer these target words. And for the written words, to make it very brief, what we find is that the English proficiency, the English placement test that our participants did was an important predictor, and intelligence, crystallized intelligence, was the other main predictor for the written stimuli. So the answer is not, is it cognition or language? It's cognition and language, and of course that is nice for me. I'm not somebody who wants to completely separate linguistic proficiency and competence from general cognition. On the contrary, I firmly believe that we have to look at these things in an integrated way. But this is debatable, especially in language acquisition studies. All right, so that's the written words, and now let's look at the spoken words. The picture is similar. It's again English, and it's again crystallized intelligence, but this time there's a third factor, and that is fluid intelligence, cognitive mechanics. That is a good predictor for this inferencing skill of these unknown but cognate words. If we look at the age development, these graphs give you the inferencing skill, the probability of being right, of being correct, across the age, because this was a lifespan study. So we tested people from 10 to almost 90 years. And so what you see here is basically how this ability changes with age. Age is just a number, I mean, number of years we've spent on this planet. But of course, we know from cognitive psychology that things in cognition change. And as if you're familiar with the literature, it's not just everything gets worse, actually things get better, and especially crystallized intelligence, that is knowledge about the world, in normal, healthy aging gets better. And this is exactly what corresponds to this curve here. It's a nonlinear relationship that goes up very steeply. So actually the young ones are pretty crap at this task. It's normal, their linguistic repertoire is still relatively small. It goes up steeply and then it still goes up until the end. So it's not that it doesn't go down. It does go down for the spoken stimuli from a certain age on, and there's a lag of about 10 years. We know that cognitive mechanics, fluid intelligence actually starts to decline even a bit earlier. So these participants get worse in the oral modality, which makes sense because we know that cognitive mechanics, keeping things in the memory loop becomes more and more difficult. And because they only heard the words once, which is pretty difficult, and then they needed to figure out the translation, they get worse with age. But overall, it's not just that the younger the better, actually on the contrary. So crystallized intelligence and skills in a genealogically related language, that is English, are important as predictors in both modalities. And then cognitive dynamics is relevant for the oral modality. And especially in the written mode, surprisingly, in a way, the older the better. Yeah. So what we see is it's not multilingualism per se. We also tested a number of languages. It wasn't an interesting predictor. It is actually skills in a related language that is English, together with German, of course, and knowledge, crystallized intelligence. We did also look at the structural overlap, at the cognateness, which you can measure, but I don't have the time to talk about this. But this idea that actually overlap of languages that you already master and the target language is the predictor for this kind of task is a very old idea in cognitive psychology, that actually transfer only happens as near transfer. So you can also only transfer cognitive functions if the tasks are very similar, and that is basically what we also find here. So these far transfer expectations, you learn Chinese and you will be better in mathematics, they're very unlikely to happen. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they're quite unlikely. Okay, so what have we found? We have found that if there's an overlap of the linguistic repertoire with the target stimulus and the target language, yes, there is an impact of the repertoire, and primarily crystallized resources are good predictors of this receptive multilingualism task. Of course, you may say, yeah, but I don't want to draw any, strong inferences based on this, because this is a relatively weird and odd task. Nobody learns languages by just guessing the cognates. That's true. So let's look at real language learning, not just cognate guessing. Okay, and that's what I'm going to show you now. Again, as a reminder, the mainstream view, as far as I can tell in the literature, is the more languages you speak, if you're a multilingual, learning additional languages must get easier. That's what you can see in this quotation on the left-hand side. When learning a new language, multilinguals are typically better than learners who have only had experience with one language. This is the multilingual boost theory of language learning. I always find it surprising when in the literature, when the literature just says that this is what everybody finds, because it's very easy to find many studies that find actually disadvantages or just no difference across monolingual versus multilingual or bilingual groups. And I think in a recent, really interesting review paper by Julia Festmann, who I think will also speak in this channel soon, she says, and I think she's absolutely right, there is no straightforward answer to the question of whether successive language learning does indeed get progressively easier. I think that, as far as I know, that's as much as we can say. It's not worse, but it's not better. It just varies. Okay, so let's look at real language learning. So the last two examples of research that I would like to share with you are from a project that we call the LAPS project. And some of it is published or will be published very soon, and you are able or will be able for the second study to download the data and scripts so that you can have a closer look at our analysis and do them better. Yeah? So this is published, this first part of the study. What we did here is we worked with 115 primary school kids in the German-speaking part of the canton where I live, in Fribourg. That's a bilingual canton, and part of it is German-speaking. They learn French as a first foreign language and English as the second foreign language. So it's compulsory, and this is the state school, so there's no selection. This is basically everybody goes to that school and learns those languages. So we tested them in April 2017 in the language of instruction. It's a reading test, standardized reading test, German. We tested their French at the same time with C-tests. And we went back at T2 about a year later and tested their English, because English starts later. So we wanted to wait a little bit to see how good their English is. So French after about 250 lessons and English about 150 lessons. Okay, so we have 3 languages tested. The last one tested about a year later than L1 and L2. We also tested cognition. We did IQ test modules. We did visual and verbal working memory tests. And because we wanted to see, yeah, of course, linguistic repertoire, that's one thing, but let's look at cognition. Okay, so what I'm doing here in a paper that I wrote together with my collaborator, Isabel Udry, we wanted to test the 2 theories. The theory 1 being the one that I just presented to you, multilingual boost. So the better you are in your languages, the larger your repertoire, the better you're going to be in the additional language. And there's also other theories, not formulated by multilingualism researchers, but more by psychologists, educational psychologists, like, for instance, Fred Genesee or Esther Geva in Toronto. And they would say there are underlying abilities that are relevant for language learning, full stop. they will be deployed in all language learning, but there's no additional benefit of experience. So that's quite a radically different view. It's not experience that shapes your additional language learning, but it is basically your underlying abilities. And in some of their publications, they even claim that most of those abilities, or a lot of them, are actually innate. I don't know, but it's a completely different theory. So what I did is I fitted two structural equation models that basically correspond to these two ideas. On the left-hand side, you can see this is cognition. It's a bit small, but you can see these are our manifest variables here for cognition that represent or measure a latent construct I call cognition, cognitive abilities. And we have the three tests in German, French, and English. So, and there's paths going basically from everything to everything else, which basically means, yes, there is an effect of cognition on language learning. Nobody would doubt that. But there's also paths going from the previous languages to the additional language, okay? Whereas the other model is much simpler. It's basically cognition that does the job, and there is no additional path here. All right, so let's see which model is better. They actually both fit okay. They're both good. They're both good models. So I could write a paper either saying, oh, yeah, this proves that multilingualism is a boost, or I could say, yeah, this proves that, but that's why I fitted both models. I want to compare them. So if you have two models that fit the data well, sufficiently well, there's procedures that help you select the better model. And I'm going to spare you the technical details, but it turns out that the simpler model should be preferred if we have to choose. All right, so the cognition model should be preferred. It's more parsimonious, it's simpler, and it explains the data equally well, or if not better. I fiddled around with the data. I also excluded pupils who speak other languages at home to see whether these estimates change, or who speak specifically the languages taught at school at home. The picture always stays the same. Okay, so to sum up this little study, it is quite uncontroversial, and all our projects have shown it, that there is an effect of cognitive variables on language learning and skills in additional languages. In this study, there seems to be no noteworthy additional effect of being multilingual, or of the skills, the multilingual skills for additional language learning. Of course, I have to do this always. You always need to do that. It's very difficult to talk about causalities here because these standardized estimates don't tell you anything about causal relationships. They just tell you to what extent constructs are associated linearly or not. So the cognition is basically now theory, and you can't experimentally test these things. You can't just say, okay, so let's take a random sample of pupils and we don't teach them languages, and to the others we teach languages, and then we see who gets better in learning English after a certain time. You can't do that for ethical reasons, also for practical reasons. Another thing that you might object to this is, yeah, this is all fine, but this focus on cognition and just the language repertoire doesn't, do justice to modern language teaching. You have to take into account also affective variables, whether these pupils are motivated or their affective dispositions. And that's what we did in the last project. I would like to show you the second part of the LABS project. With a larger sample here in a different area, but also German-speaking Switzerland, but this time English is the first foreign language and French the second. They're about the same age. And again, we tested language, this time with a Oxford Young Learners test, and we ran a whole battery of psychometric tests, and we asked them a lot of questions about their parents, we also asked the parents questions and the teachers, and about motivation, about income, about how they live, about whether they read to their kids, that kind of thing, how many books they have, all kind of information about the background. All right, because I forgot to tell you that there's the idea that you're multilingual, you're going to be better at additional language learning. But from educational scientists, we also hear in Switzerland, oh, this curriculum is overburdened. The standard curriculum in schools is overburdened with languages. And because we have quite a substantial proportion of migrant children in our classes who speak other languages at home, for them learning 3 languages, the language of education and 2 foreign languages, is too much. They're overburdened. So there's actually 2 theories. One says they should be better learning additional languages, and the other says they're going to be overburdened. So let's look at the results here. So to what extent does family background, among other things also whether kids speak other languages at home or not, predict skill in the target foreign language? So descriptively, if you look at the left panel here, what you see here is just the English score at T1, the first time of testing. And what you see here is whether the kids speak German as one of the languages at home, any kind of German, dialect or standard, or not. And those who do are slightly better than those who don't. And of course, you could test this and it would most certainly be significant, but that's not relevant here because we know that things are a lot more complicated and we have all this information about these pupils in our project. So we have to do a slightly more sophisticated statistical analysis. But descriptively, it even looks like the more monolingual kids seem to be better learning English than the multilingual kids often with a migrant background. Migrant background in Switzerland can also mean from Italian-speaking or French-speaking parts of the country. So it doesn't have to be foreigners. All right. So I fitted again a structural equation model. And I'm not going to explain to you all the details. You don't need to understand them. You just have to believe me that this is not something I just came up with, but that it is actually validated by factor analytical steps that I won't show you here. So we have 4 constructs here. The first down here is what we call cognition, which is basically all these cognitive measures, working memory, intelligence, and other things, but also language ability, language learning aptitude tests that we did. So the ability to quickly map, words to phonological forms, or remember them, or doing inferences in an unknown artificial language, that kind of thing. The second construct here is what we call academic emotion. It's basically affective questions, intrinsic motivation to learn a language, but also anxiety, whether kids are anxious, expressing themselves in the foreign language class, and the self-concept they have of themselves as learner of the target language, English. The third construct here is cultural predispositions of the homes, which basically means how educated are the parents, how many books, that kind of question. And also whether they speak the local language at home, which for me is part of the cultural, background, if you like, cultural capital, as Bourdieu would call it. And then economic predispositions, savings, income, wealth, basically. Okay, and all of this. So the question is, to what extent do these things actually predict English as the English skill at T1? And I won't, explain all these estimates now to you. But it turns out that if we control for these 4 aspects, what you find is that these 2 predispositions, so the cultural and the economic predispositions, no longer play a direct role for learning English. What they do, however, is they are quite strongly associated with the cognitive variable here, and to some extent also with this emotional variable here. So they have, I'm not saying they don't have any impact, but if they have an impact, it's an indirect impact via cognition. Cognition, on the other hand, is strongly associated with English, and also the emotional aspects are associated with English. And that's actually the reason why I'm showing you this, is that I singled out now the question whether these kids speak German at home, yes or no, so that you can see what remains, if I account for all of this, what remains as an impact of being a speaker of German at home, yes or no, and the impact is basically 0. There's nothing left. So basically, what this tells us, this question of speaking the target language at home, yes or no, is irrelevant if we control for everything else, which is quite complicated. I can tell you, these poor kids had to do a lot of testing. Okay, so if we control for background constructs as those, as I just explained, no noteworthy estimates remain from this background to English. There's no specific effect of being a speaker of the local language or not, therefore being more or less multilingual. And when we control for all of this, there's no multilingualism effect left. All right, so I'm summing up now the whole talk. And I know you're probably bored of this figure here, but I can assure you it's the last time you see it. So what we find in many projects, we did more projects, but what we find consistently is, yes, there is, the linguistic repertoire plays a role, but massive transfer can only be shown if there's a high degree of overlap of the acquired languages with the target stimuli or language overall. Previous learning, therefore, is not completely irrelevant, but it's not just previous learning across the board that will determine the outcome in the target language. On the other hand, we see consistent effect of cognition as soon as we test for cognition, and these multilingual boost effects are arguably not just effects of the linguistic repertoire, but of some kind of working together of cognition and the repertoire. And if I had to choose, my impression is that if I had to choose which one is more important, I would say probably cognition is more important, because it's, as Esther Geva would say, as Genesee would say, it is underlying all learning or language learning, as far as I can tell. So, as I already mentioned, multilingualism effects are hard to test experimentally, because in many contexts, at least in my context here in Switzerland, multilingualism is just a fact of life. Multilingualism is not that people become multilingual because that they think languages are so wonderful. It's just, I mean, I couldn't survive just speaking my native dialect. That would be not a very interesting life to live. So, you know, you just have to become multilingual in many contexts. Speakers of minority languages even more so. So it's just a fact of life, and it's very difficult to do experimental studies that, you know, really test multilingualism or bilingualism as a condition on learning additional languages. So multilingual is just a fact of life for many of us. It has been in the past, it's nothing new, and not a choice. So coming back to my initial slide here. So we're doing research in a field that is highly ideological, where we have biases, and I only mentioned two, there's many more. And so to sum up, I can completely understand why many scholars see themselves as martial art scientists. Like Bourdieu said, research as martial art, which doesn't mean anything is allowed. On the contrary, but you know, it is a sport de combat. So that you're very engaged, you want to defend the status of your minority language or dialect, or of a specific type of bilingualism, the rights of migrants, whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. And it is a legitimate reaction, I guess, to extreme monolingualist ideologies. The problem is that there's many forms of activism out there now, so there's actually even conflicts among activists on what, you know, should be given priority. I'm not saying that activism is a priori incompatible with doing research. However, for me, I'm still, you may find this very old-fashioned, but I still strive for axiological neutrality, as Max Weber called it, because I just see the damage that the biases do. In other words, I still think I would like my research to be relevant. Let's put it that way. I'd like my research to be relevant regardless of my political ideas and social ideologies. So completely regardless of what I think about how the perfect society should be, I hope that what we're doing is a meaningful contribution to multilingualism research as a field where we investigate the multiple language learning, okay? So, because I just see that biases can actually undermine our discipline. I could give you concrete examples, and I've written about this, where there's such a strong multilingual boost bias, together with this idea that multilingualism is good for the political development of the country, that promises are made and curricula are planned based on those assumptions. And then if you look at the educational outcomes, the transfer, the boost doesn't happen, which is what we see in Switzerland. And that's, of course, very problematic, because then the policymakers will say, you linguists told us that this was going to happen. It's not happening. So I think we should be slightly more cautious with our enthusiasm about what we expect multilingualism to do. which is not to say that I don't like multilingual. I love multilingual. I'm a multilingual, but not everybody is like me, fortunately, you would say. And I also think that we should also think of other values of multilingualism, not just, what can it do for society or what can it do for multiple language learning, but maybe also other values, more general values, and that's perfectly legitimate to think about those things as well. So yeah, I hope that I've given you some insight in the way we do research, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm curious to see whether there are going to be questions in the YouTube channel or anywhere else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raphael, for this very inspiring talk. And I just wanted to ask if there are any questions. I can see a question on the YouTube channel from Professor Agnieszka Szarkowska, and she says the following: I was wondering which English proficiency test you used to test reading and which one you would recommend.
Oh, that's a good question. So, I mean, I'm happy to send you stuff. So in the last study, we actually used the Oxford Young Learners test. You can see it online. So there's not a specific reading module. It's, if I remember correctly, we do so many tests. I think it's a listening module and general language use, which also involves reading, of course. So that's what we did for English. The reading test I mentioned, maybe that was too quick and not clear, was a standardized German reading test. And for French, we used C tests, just a standardized procedure of the tests. Yeah.
There's another question from Breno Silva, who says, and I was wondering whether we can have access to the intelligence measures you used. I mean, the tests you used to derive the variables to control for cognition, working memory, aptitude, etc.
Yeah, so the psychometric tests are all, we didn't invent anything. They're all either completely standardized as parts of standardized test batteries or adaptations. So for instance, the visual working memory, we did on an experimental platform, we adapted the Corsi blocks procedure. Yes, it's all in the publications, and yeah, most of these tests are standardized. Sometimes we didn't do the whole test, just a short version for the sake of time. And for language aptitude, that's a tricky one. We actually have an ongoing project where the same problem is, actually, we have the same problem again. There is, in the languages that we need, there is nothing standardized. And the standardized tests like the MLOT or the PLAB are not always readily available. We had very good contact with the company that sells them, and we got the permission to do some adaptations and translations of those of some modules of those tests. I'm happy to share as much information with you as I can. Just send me an email. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple more questions from the same person. I think it is Professor Michał Paradowski. Rather than the constructs failing to influence performance, may it be that it's the measure, so ravens or self-assessment, that do not exactly reflect fluid intelligence or multilingual repertoire? So maybe the tests fail us.
All tests have measurement errors. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So you're right. We just took the best tests at hand. I mean, but that's a standard disclaimer that you have to do. That's why I mean, that's, the scholars in this field deliberately do not say we have measured the construct. What we have measured is a manifest variable with a certain measurement error that is by the field considered a manifest measure of something relevant for the construct. But the construct is latent. You cannot measure the construct directly. You always have to access it indirectly. That is, so your point is absolutely true. I just don't know what to do. So either you say, well, this is all irrelevant, we don't test at all. If you want to test, you just have to live with the compromise, the measurement error.
We have some more examples here. So the same person says we found that the number of languages spoken does not matter for third language acquisition success, but cumulative competence in background languages does.
Yeah, I tried that too, like adding up, although it is from the measurement point of view, it's a bit weird adding up, like for instance, European frame of reference levels and just, giving them numbers and adding them up. You can do it. I tried to do it. So for instance, the very first study I showed, I did that too. It basically, the linear association was exactly the same as with number of languages, but you're right, you can do that. And if you have very unbalanced proficiency, it may give you more relevant and more precise information about the repertoire. That's right. Yes. Yeah.
May I ask a question too? Because I've been reading those questions. Yeah, I was thinking about that perhaps linear models don't quite reflect the reality. Maybe we should start using slightly different statistics.
Yeah, we did. I mean, as you've seen, I mean, for instance, the age, that was a nonlinear model.
Yeah.
We did try GUMS, yeah, generalized additive model. I mean, Jan van Over, whose work I referred to, did that. We also did it in other projects. So wherever it is possible, we do it. I have to say, very often the association is pretty linear. So for instance, in the labs project, I did check whether there were, like something happening on some kind of, that would be evidence for instance, for thresholds. There's this idea out there that there are, you need to come to a certain threshold and then everything will explode or not. And I did, so wherever it was possible, I tried it. I didn't find any strong evidence beyond the age. Of course, age is a nonlinear predictor, but just, other than that, I didn't find anything important.
Okay, right. So there's an interesting discussion here between Michał Paradowski and Tomasz Bąk, so Thomas Bach, that you actually mentioned in your talk, but I think they are just chatting here, okay, about the interesting results. So I will read the next question. May it be that immigrants in Switzerland are more likely to have relatively higher socioeconomic status or cultural capital than in other countries?
I don't think so, but basically the model I've shown you controls for that. I mean, it accounts for the variability of. You are of course right that there is, I mean, immigrant is a strange term, is a very imprecise term. I think when I said immigrants, I mean, for the sake of brevity, I referred to, the debate is always about the problematic immigrants. Of course, it's not about expats. Wealthy people coming in, working in the tech industry or in the pharmaceutical. So it's blue collar migration that is perceived as being problematic in those debates. But no, I mean, it's not true that there's only rich people coming. I mean, I know that people think that everybody in Switzerland is a millionaire. I can assure you, I'm not.
Aren't you? And you have good chocolate.
It's not just rich people coming in. So no, and this is, and again, this is a state school. This is not private school. So this is really schools with very, very high percentages or very, quite considerable heterogeneity in an urban context in the second study. So yeah.
Okay, another question comes from Nicole Marx. Thank you. The reminder that it can be dangerous to instrumentalize languages. For instance, in some German states, funding for heritage languages was cut after students did not show significant gains in German. It's a comment rather than a question.
Yeah, and I think it's and that is why, Nicole, that's why I made the last point in my presentation. That's why I think that's exactly what I mean, that we undermine our own position as researchers, but also maybe we might also undermine our ideological position if we have these transfer expectations and then they are not met. And that's why I believe that when we talk about these heritage languages, we should think about other values. I'm not against, thinking about values also as scholars, but it shouldn't be just those instrumental values, because as far as I can tell, and some of you may know that we also worked on heritage languages, these transfer expectations are just rarely met, in the empirical reality. So I think I totally agree, but so both are actually true. That's why we must not make false promises of which we know by now that they're not going to be fulfilled by reality, and think about other values of multilingualism. Yeah. I mean, that's the point where I actually agree with the multilingual if you like, for instance, the view on multilingualism of the Council of Europe, I think it is, it is relevant for our societies to think about these migrant languages in terms of values. But that's a political view. That's my personal view. Again, what is important for me is that my scholarly work is not biased by this ideological view on the things.
Mm-hmm. Sure, thank you. Okay, there's another question from Renata Peskova. Thank you for this informative presentation. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the use of multilingualism for language teaching.
Thoughts, yes, but I don't have any robust evidence. I mean, that's why we need exactly the kind of research Agnieszka does, and that's why we need, field experiments and tryouts. I mean, I have thoughts. I could also talk about, some of our institute does quite a lot of large-scale assessment, so we can actually compare the old way of teaching languages in a more monolingual perspective and the new way, which is highly influenced by this idea about multilingual language teaching. I could talk about this, but this wasn't my talk, and I am very cautious when it comes to causality. Because things change, the teaching paradigm changes, but other things change as well. So can we really draw conclusions based simply on the change in teaching paradigm? But there are some studies. Some of my students actually did do studies. So one of them, for instance, investigated reading skills in French as a foreign language taught in a more monolingual perspective and in a more multilingual perspective, and the result was that the monolingual perspective was clearly better. But I mean, that's just one study, and I'm not saying we should draw hasty conclusions based on that, but there is studies out there, and we need more studies that actually tap into different ways of teaching and their effect on not only what is learned, but maybe also how it is learned.
Mm-hmm. Yes, another question comes from Martin Testa. In your study from 2008, you mentioned that dialect proficiency was a better, was a better predictor of cognate recognition than the total number of languages spoken. Do you think that people who master several dialects or several registers of the same language may be used to paying attention to more subtle differences than people who speak two distantly related languages?
That's an excellent question, and that is, I mean, I've written about that, and that's exactly my theory. I can't prove it. It's what I call abduction in receptive multilingualism, because it's an abductive inference that you're drawing. You're drawing on your knowledge, and of course, dialect speakers or speakers, take the speakers of Scandinavian languages, take the Norwegians who are dialect speakers, but also understand Swedish and sometimes also Danish, although Danish, understanding Danish is quite a challenge, but it is possible. So, you develop specific dia systems, they are sometimes called, with closely related languages that are very similar but then systematically different, and you can draw on this. You just know what are actually plausible interlingual differences. You know that it's an R can become an O relatively easily. That's just a minor change. But an R becoming an I and E is relatively unlikely, because you just don't have it in dialect pairs. And that, so what you describe is exactly, that would be my theory. But I mean, I can't prove that theory because it's all going on in our minds. But yes, I mean, that's what I believe is the case. Yeah.
So will you say, sorry, that's my interruption here, but will you say that it will be related to frequencies of certain constructions or certain occurrences in the language? Because basically language acquisition is frequency based, right? So do you think that when we speak several dialects, we are kind of more sensitive to those frequency related patterns? Or?
Well, luckily for the kind of thing that I've shown here, the cognates, basically what matters is, yes, of course, I mean, the corpus frequency of the words in the languages that you master is we measured it. It is a predictor, but a pretty bad one, but it is significantly associated with the outcome. But I think your question is interesting, because you basically point out another phenomenon of frequency, which is, of course, the systematic occurrence of sounds.
Yep.
And of course, the sounds in a language are highly frequent. I mean, virtually all of them, except some borrowed in, sounds. But so the vowels are high frequency, of course. So and because if you're a polydialectal speaker, you just know, oh yeah, we say Straße and the others say Stroß, and then there's people that that say Straße. So you just know that, and so you can draw these inferences more easily.
Okay, there's a question from Tomasz Bong. I was wondering whether the dialectability, which turned out as potentially relevant in your studies, were there any German-speaking pupils who did not speak Swiss German as well as High German?
Yes, there were some. I did. So in the Swiss German context, there are some speakers of Standard German who are from German families and who don't learn the dialect. We're talking about primary school kids, and in primary school you want to be like everybody else. So actually the German kids usually become bidialectal very quickly. There are exceptions always. It's a funny question because I wrote my thesis about this. There are some exceptions that keep speaking the standard language even when everybody else speaks the dialect, but it's relatively exceptional, and it is more frequent in, for instance, in Fribourg. It's relatively frequent because there's also French, so it's complicated. So you have French, you have the dialect, and you have Standard German, and so there it is more likely. Yeah, there were some of these speakers, but I don't think it changes anything. I mean, in the last two projects I showed, in the first one, that's exactly what I controlled, and those were not pupils; those were adults, young adults, and that's exactly what I test. I mean, that's what I controlled for, whether they had dialect proficiency or not.
Yeah. Okay, there's another question from Hilal Shahin. Thank you for the presentation. Do you think results would be different if teachers taught in a multilingual way, meaning they actively integrate students' prior linguistic knowledge into teaching?
Good question. Well, of course, I can't say I don't know because I'm here. I'm the professor of multilingualism. I need to have an answer always. So what I'm going to tell you is just that imagine that you have a highly heterogeneous class, and you have speakers of Kurdish, of different varieties, of Arabic, of Croatian, of Serbian, of Albanian, of African languages, of Swahili, French and Italian and Portuguese. I mean, I'm happy if you can integrate those first languages in a way that makes sense. I mean, this is amazing. I just couldn't make that recommendation right now because I don't see on a very practical level how that could be done. Now, there are people, so we did have an interesting project at our institute. I was not involved, where the group of researchers actually looked at what do teachers do, because they are incited to do exactly what you described. So they looked at what actually teachers do and how pupils then behave and how they perceive it. And I'm happy to send you the references. It's published. It doesn't allow, I don't think we're in a position to say it's good or it's bad for language learning, but there you can see at least, practices that are implemented, and maybe also problems with those practices. But so I was talking very, extensively, but basically I don't know.
I thought that maybe Hilal Sahin's question was about foreign languages. So making connections between the foreign languages that the pupils were learning, like French and English, for instance.
Okay. Yes.
Maybe that's my guess, right? Okay.
Okay. So sorry if I misunderstood your question. Yes, I mean that's being done in our, at least in our context, and I think it makes sense. So, for instance, if you have a lot of cognate words, pointing them out makes sense. But I mean, here Agnieszka would be well positioned. I mean, it's simply raising awareness about the cognateness. As far as I can tell, does not seem to lead to massive gains. Yeah. And that's what you found, and that's also what we see in our assessment data. So maybe we have to try to find better ways of doing it. But again, I don't know.
Well, basically, that was the last question, I think. If I can't see any more on the chat, well, and if this is it, right? So, Raphael, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for this very, very informative talk. thought-provoking, and well, I think we have to digest it, and we have a lot to think about during the afternoon and evening and the rest of the week, right? And well, from this position, I would also like to welcome everybody to the second talk that we're going to have next week. Next week, we're not going to look at simple facts. We're going to look at the affective factors. So we're going to look at how difficult it is to express emotions in a foreign language. So next week, we're going to welcome Professor Jean-Marc Deval from the University of London. Right. So Raphael, thank you once again for being with us, and thank you everybody for listening to the talk and for being with us, for asking questions. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.